Hey, Jeff, can folks hear me in the back?
We can go to Subway, or we can go to that.
My name's Dustin Banks, and I'm the Deputy Operations Project Manager for the Corps of Engineers here at the Willamette Valley Project. So the 13th dams here in the valley. See many of you before. I'm up here pretty frequently. Just want to kick things off tonight and maybe explain a little bit about what we're here to do. This is a follow-up to a meeting we had a couple months ago to gather input on some proposed alternatives for downstream passage and temperature management at Detroit. And what we're here to do tonight is to come back and update everybody on what it is we've heard, how we're using that information to shape this project in ways that will be the least impactful and give us the greatest chance at success for the required action that we have. And that's to figure out a way to get juvenile fish downstream and help better manage temperature on the North Sandy End. Had some good side conversations with folks. I know there's some really specific questions. We have a lot of information to present. So what I'd ask is if something's not clear or if you can't hear something that comes across, please ask the question at the time. But if you have questions, hold the majority of them until the end of the presentation. What we're going to do is we'll have some Q&A at the end, but then we brought a number of folks down that are subject matter experts in NEPA, in construction management, in various parts of the process, where folks can go and ask really specific questions if you have them, the people that are working on this for us. This is the way the process is designed to work. I know that for something that's one of the most complicated projects we're likely to work on in our lifetime, maybe that you will see here in the basin, it seems like where we are in the process is a bit confusing. So we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk about the alternatives that we're considering and how we're working to shape those. But this is how the process is designed to work. We come up with alternatives for an action that we have to take. We go out and we gather feedback so we understand the concerns and the impacts that those alternatives are likely to have. We take that back and we continue to work this process to make this project as good as we can possibly make it, to minimize the impacts to the greatest extent possible. And this is how it's designed to work. It's really the example of what it was designed to do. So that's what Kelly and Jeff are going to talk about tonight. This isn't a decision-making meeting. This is not one where we're going to be doing testimony. It's really an opportunity for you to get informed on where we are in the process, understand how we use all that feedback that you've given us, and then line out what comes next so that you know, again, down the road where there will be more opportunities to engage, where to plug into that process. Kelly, Jeff, anything I missed? With that, I'll turn it over to Kelly. Thanks.
I will use this. That let you through it. Very sensitive. All right, how does that sound? Cool. All right, so I'm Kelly James. I'm the Environmental Resource Specialist. That's my official title on this project. What that really means is I'm the person leading the environmental impacts analysis and the NEPA process. I'll also be presenting with the project manager, Jeff Min, and we're going to do a back and forth, take different slides, some of the more engineering technical slides he'll take on, and he's been working on this project since the very beginning. But like Dustin said, the real purpose of today is to walk you through the entire alternatives analysis up until this point, and to point out how public comment during our scoping period has helped us shape the alternatives and our environmental impacts analysis so that we're really covering everything that is of concern to the community. So first I'll go over the project purpose and need. This is kind of a term of art under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and it really is the foundation of a project. So all alternatives must meet the purpose and need of the project. If it doesn't meet the purpose and need, then it needs to be screened out. So that's really why it's really important to understand what we're proposing and why we're proposing it, which is the need. Then I'll go through the history. It's a kind of complicated timeline slide, so we'll go through it step by step. It might take a minute. And then I'll talk about the screening criteria, so how we decided what alternatives weren't going to work and what alternatives are moving forward. And then I'll talk about each alternative that we looked at from the beginning all the way until now. So those include alternatives for achieving water temperature control, alternatives for downstream passage, which has two components: collecting the fish and then transporting the fish downstream so that they can be released. And then we'll talk about the construction alternatives and the staging alternatives. And then finally, I'll just show you a table showing the final array of alternatives that will be analyzed in detail in the environmental impact statement. And then we'll, like Dustin said, we'll go into a Q&A session. We'll do a short open forum, and then we'll ask everyone to go back to the back of the room and talk to the experts one-on-one. All right, so the overall purpose of this project is we want to achieve above dam populations of upper Willamette Chinook salmon, which are the listed species, to be able to, so that their population can replace itself on average over time. That's the overarching goal. The need for the project is that we have a biological opinion from the National Marine Fisheries Service, also known as NIMS, I'll probably say NIMS a lot. In 2008, they came out with this BIOP, which said, core your project, the Willamette project, which includes 13 dams. We have a board in the back that kind of explains where Detroit lands in that 13 dam system. Is going to jeopardize these endangered fish. So in order to avoid jeopardizing these fish and potentially causing their extinction, you need to do a few things, and two of them were downstream fish passage at Detroit Dam and temperature control at Detroit Dam. These are two of many measures that are required in the BIOP. So the Corps is working through a slew of measures across the Willamette Valley to address the jeopardy of this fish species, and this is just one aspect of it. That'll be important later when we talk about the history. And then the purpose of the project, so like I said, if we're not meeting the purpose, then we have to screen out an alternative, is specifically to enhance fish passage at Detroit Dam for this specific species, and to modify temperatures in the North Sanian below the dam to meet the temperature targets optimized for this specific species. Oops, okay. So the biological opinion came out in 2008. This is what started us off. As soon as that came out, we went out to the public to try to explain what this meant for the Willamette Valley and each of the basins within the valley. And then we started looking at how are we going to achieve this. And this kind of has a couple layers. The first layer is what's called the Willamette Valley Configurations and Operations Plan, or the Willamette Valley COP. And the COP really looks at the whole basin and the hundreds of different measures that we're supposed to implement. Everything from ramping rates at the dam, downstream fish passage at several dams, temperature control at Detroit, some restoration projects. There's many measures that we have to deal with. So the COP is really looking at all of those throughout the basin and prioritizing them. In order to prioritize them, though, they have to look at each specific one and say, what are the potential alternatives for meeting this specific measure, and also how expensive might it be, how successful will it be compared to other measures, so they can prioritize each one and decide when in time it needs to happen. So in order to do that, they created the Detroit Engineering Documentation Report team that looks specifically at the Detroit projects. And that team is a team of experts that works on the engineering and environmental issues, and then they go back to the COP and give them a report out, and the COP says, okay, in the grand scheme of things, this is prioritized over this or under this. So it's this back and forth iterative process between this larger goal and this very specific goals at each dam. So this area, from 2009 until 2017, they started looking at the initial array of alternatives, everything under the sun. And this is really a 10,000-foot view of the problem. They're not looking at specific costs at each dam. They're looking at, generally this will cost this many millions of dollars, and it's this likely to be successful compared to another project. And these are the risks, the overall risks, and things like that. In 2010, we went out to the public to try to explain this COP process. And then in 2013, we actually went out, and once Detroit's EDR team got a little further along, we went out to the public and said, here are some of the things we've been looking at. It's not all the things, but this is our first cut at the problem. And during that whole time, we were doing what's called an environmental assessment under NEPA. There's several layers of NEPA. The first one really is to do an environmental assessment. At the end of that process, you either say there won't be significant impacts from this project, and you come out with your action, or you say, yes, there will be significant impacts from this project, and we should do an environmental impact statement, which is a much longer and more intense analysis, and it requires more public outreach. So in 2017, after looking at the initial array of alternatives, we decided that yes, we are going to have significant impacts from this project and we should do an EIS. Instead of coming out with a report saying that these are our analysis thus far, and we decided to do an EIS, we decided not to waste time on that and just go straight to the EIS. And that's when we started scoping, which we received many comments from, I'm sure many of you in the room. So public scoping is basically, we come out and we say, here's the project, purpose and need. Here are some of the alternatives we're looking at. What are you most concerned about? And we get your comments. And then every comment that we get, we have to address in the EIS. So any concerns that we got, if we weren't looking at that topic before, we now have to include it in the EIS. So if you submitted a comment, your comment will be addressed in the draft EIS that you'll see later this year, or later in 2019. All right, the next phase of the project for the design team was we've screened out some of the alternatives because they weren't feasible, they didn't meet our purpose and need, some other screening criteria weren't met, and so we have a much narrower array, we call the final array or focused array, and that's when they start getting to the 1,000-foot view, where we're looking at more detailed costs. We're looking at how does this, we're actually doing numerical modeling to look at how flows work and whether we're meeting the very strict NIMS biological criteria for the fish. So this is a much more detailed look at the analysis. And we're starting to do more detailed cost estimates. In addition, we started the EIS process, which is basically, we did scoping and now we're really looking at what impacts should we include, what are the analyses that we need to do to really look at these impacts and be able to tell the public exactly what we think will happen once we build the project. And also, reach out to the public again and say, here are all the alternatives we've looked at. So this is where we are today, and you'll get to see the alternatives we looked at and why we screened some out. And then later in early 2019, they'll actually be going into plans and specifications. And this is actually like really close-up view. Every nut, bolt, and type of concrete is what they're looking at during plans and specs. And the reason it's overlapping with the EIS is that there might be some changes that will have an effect on the environment in that plans and specs process, and we want to be able to capture that in the EIS. So we made sure that that overlapped a little bit. And so once we finish the draft EIS, we will release it for public review and comment, and you'll have another chance to comment. And we will have to address those comments in the final EIS. And that is tentatively scheduled for April of 2019. All right, so once plans and specs are over, we're going to start phase 1 of implementation, which is construction of the actual temperature control piece of the project. We're doing this in phases because we want to incorporate lessons learned from other projects for downstream passage, since it's a really difficult engineering problem, and we're actually doing downstream passage at Cougar Dam, which will be built before Detroit, so we wanted to be able to incorporate some of the lessons learned from Cougar into Detroit. So that plans and specs will be done in 2025, and then we'll implement phase 2. Right now I'd just like to note that downstream passage under any of our alternatives does not require a drawdown. So this may look like, oh, we might have potential drawdown impacts in both if that's the alternative that's chosen. And in fact, that's not the case. The only thing that may require a drawdown is the temperature control phase of the project. And then finally, throughout this implementation phase, we will also be reaching out to the public throughout so that you'll have chances to hear about what we're planning and how it might affect you. All right, so looking at screening criteria, there's biological criteria that we have to meet. And this basically shows us whether or not we're meeting that purpose and need. The first criteria is called the Viable Salmoniid Population, or VSP. This is an actual numerical model. It's actually 3 numerical models that work together. And it basically gets at measure of population extinction risk. And we use this early on to say, set a really low bar and say, are we even going to get close to getting replacement of the dam for the population? If we're not even getting close, then we're not going to look at this alternative anymore, because it's not really worth all the time and energy and cost to develop something that we know is just not going to work. So it's a very low bar. And then the other criteria we use is, as we get more detailed in our designs, we're able to use this much more detailed design criteria for water flow, holding, transporting the fish. There's a manual that NIMS has come out with that's very specific on what we need to meet to be able to say that we're successfully doing downstream passage. And then also the temperature targets, which are based on post-buyout targets, as well as some newer targets that came out in 2017. And then finally, there's a water quality criteria for total dissolved gas that we need to make sure we're also meeting. And then in addition to meeting our criteria, we also cannot violate any of these constraints. Constraints are basically just restrictions, and they usually have to do with authorized purposes and health and safety. So the first and potentially most important one is that we have to meet our flood risk management mission at Detroit Dam no matter what, in any phase of the project, because it's the purpose of the dam. And we don't want to put anyone at risk downstream. So that's one. If any of alternatives put a flood risk at all, then it was screened out. The second is that all of our alternatives have to meet dam safety requirements. That's a pretty obvious one for health and safety. And then finally, over the long term, we can have short-term impacts to these, but over the long term, we have to meet our other authorized purposes for the dam, which includes recreation, water supply, and hydropower. So if one of our alternatives means that we're not going to be able to produce the power of the dam in the long term, it was screened out. All right, so this is going to talk a little bit more about how the COP works with the EDR and how we got down to the alternatives we have now. First is there's the whole Willamette Valley focus, and then there's the Detroit focus. And these work together. So there's first the COP analysis that looks at and prioritizes all the measures across the Willamette Valley. And that uses information from Detroit team to help them prioritize things, looking at cost and risk and other factors. Sorry, I'm getting a little parched. They also set that VSP biological criteria, and the EDR team used that criteria to do their first run of screening. The first filter that we really looked at was, is this even feasible technologically, engineering-wise, or in doing a very large cost analysis of, very high level, not very detailed at all cost analysis, weighing different projects against each other. And then also the risk analysis that looked at whether or not we were going to violate our constraints. The second level of filtering was that VSP biological criteria that I talked about. And then as we got more detailed in our design, we looked at that fish passage and temperature target criteria. And then finally, we move into the DDR, the Detroit Design Documentation, which is that more refined documentation report that continues to use that passage criteria as we get more detailed, but now we're also looking at detailed costs and detailed impacts. So the DDR goes to our EIS team and says, hey, what are the impacts? Oh, water supply is a really big concern for the public. Should we be looking at that more closely in terms of each alternative in our final array and what those water supply impacts are, and maybe prioritize some alternatives over others? And then we provide that information to the design team, and they re-look at each alternative and refine it. So this iterative design process where we're not really making a ton of decisions other other than screening out ones that really aren't feasible or not going to meet criteria until this phase, until we get really designed, or really detailed. And then eventually we'll get to a selected or preferred alternative, which we have not gotten to yet. All right, so getting into salmon a little bit. I'm not going to talk about all the design criteria, but at a very high level, we screened a lot of alternatives because of salmon behavior. We've done a lot of research and monitoring to look at where salmon are and how they behave. And one thing that we know for sure from all of our analysis and sampling and monitoring of the fish at Detroit is that salmon are surface oriented. They stay at the top of the water and they're looking for flow. They're looking for a waterfall to get down. So they don't like to dive deep. They like to stay at the surface and they're looking for that waterfall. They like that a lot. This is the dam. We have several ways for fish to get through it right now. We have the spillway at the top, which is only accessible during certain times of year when the reservoir is high enough. Then we have the penstocks, which is how we make hydropower, where the turbines are. And then we have what are called regulating outlets, which help us manage how much water is leaving, especially for flood control. And those are at the very bottom of the dam. So they're super deep, like hundreds of feet deep. And then we also have a little test conduit that the Navy put in that we don't really use, but some of our alternatives looked at potentially using that. What we know for sure is that fish are attracted to that spillway because it looks like a giant waterfall. However, it's also a 400-foot slip and slide that's made out of concrete. So there's a lot of mortality and injury associated with fish going down that. So any alternative that focuses fish on moving through the spillway is likely to be screened out. Additionally, the penstocks are really dangerous because they're going through turbines. And then, like I said, fish don't like to dive. So anything that focuses fish to go through the ROs is not going to be successful because they don't like to dive that deep. And then finally, we looked at cost in the sense of looking at two alternatives together. Does this save us impacts, or does this mitigate impacts? Maybe it's a little more costly. Maybe we should go towards that if it reduces impacts. A lot of alternatives we looked at in that lens, we found that they didn't actually decrease impacts and they didn't decrease costs, so there was really no point to moving forward with them, so we screened those out. So anytime you see that money sign with an X through it, it just means that we compared it to another alternative. It didn't really minimize any impacts, and it either costs more or costs just as much. All right, so in total, we looked at 21 alternatives for water temperature control, 8 alternatives for fish collection, 3 alternatives for fish transport, 7 alternatives for different ways to construct these projects, and 8 alternatives for where to stage materials and equipment. Of those totals, 4 temperature control, 1 fish collection, 1 transport, 3 construction, and 2 staging areas we got from the public. So we heard those comments, and then our team took them back and did an analysis on them to see, are these feasible? Is this a really good solution that we haven't thought about? So that's kind of how your comments have been used in our process. All right, now getting to the meat of the presentation. So we're going to talk through temperature control. I'm going to switch back and forth with Jeff. We're going to start with operational. So this is basically, we're not going to build anything. How can we operate the dam better to meet our temperature targets? The first alternative we looked at was use existing equipment, just optimize how we use the dam. We're actually already doing this. In 2007, we started operating the dam to use the spillway. I have boards in the back that talk about why temperature is a problem. So if you have questions about that at the end, please go head back there and we can talk you through it. Basically, the temperatures are too cold in the summertime because we're only using water from very deep in the reservoir where it's really cold. And then in the fall, we've used all that deep cold water and we're left with the hot water, and the water is too hot for the fish. So it's too cold in the summer for the fish and it's too hot in the fall. It has all sorts of biological implications. But in order to address at least the summer issue, we say, we now operate the dam in so that when the spillway is accessible, we allow water to go over it. That's why sometimes you see us spilling water in the summertime. And that allows us to access that hot water at the top. And it actually does a really good job of meeting our temperature targets. Unfortunately, it only works when the water is high enough to reach the spillway, which is only a short time period in the summer. And then the water goes below the spillway and we have no more access. Also, like I said, the fish going down the spillway is not the best for fish passage, and they're attracted to it. So we screened out the optimized temperatures because it just doesn't work. The next one was to basically drain the lake to run a river, which is make the lake into a river throughout the conservation season, which is the summer season, when we're using water for water conservation. So that has obvious impacts to the long-term other authorized purposes, like hydropower. We wouldn't be able to use that for hydropower. There would be the lake, so there would be very little access for recreation. And then a lot of that water is important for flow downstream for water supply. And so we wouldn't be meeting the water supply authorized purpose either. The next one, so that was straight up, obviously. The next one was to delay the drawdown of the reservoir. That didn't really meet our fish passage criteria. It also hindered our flood control criteria because we really do need to drop the water down in the fall, starting in the fall and in the winter, to make room for the flood flows that come through. So we screened that one out. And then operate the reservoir at minimum conservation year-round, which is basically 1450. I think the Mongol's long boat ramp goes to 1450, so that's the only access that would be available. So it doesn't meet the authorized purposes. It also doesn't do a great job of meeting the temperature targets, so we screen that out. So I'll hand it over for Jeff.
So I'm going to talk about some of the other alternatives. Maybe, I think you can hear me fine, but can you hear me fine back there?
Yeah.
Okay. So some of the alternatives we looked at here are, I'm going to say, easier alternatives that we're modifying the dam. So the first one up there is modify the existing equipment for lower flows. So you see that canner gate, that's one of the spillway gates. But you have to crack that open, you have a minimum opening, which dumps a whole lot of water. So the idea here was to put smaller gates within that spillway gate to let less water out. But that was ruled out because, as Kelly has already said, we had the fish going down that spillway, that's not safe. And it only operates for temperature whenever we're above spillway crest, so it's not all the time that we'd be able to do that. So that was ruled out. Then another one we had was new outlets in the dam at various depths between existing outlets. And you see on the bottom there, that image, and that's, we got the spillway up high, we've got the regular outlets down low. It was to poke some other holes in the dam to get different elevations. And we decided that doesn't need muster either, because now you got just a couple fixed holes, and you got to try to hit the right temperature targets, and that's difficult. And fish would have to dive down to go through whatever one's closest to the top. And it doesn't meet all of our authorized purposes, so that was ruled out. Then another one was, we have limitations on when we can operate the different regulated outlets because of head restrictions, in other words, how deep the water is and how much force there would be on those. So we looked at, can we modify those different outlets to allow them to operate over different ranges? And that was ruled out as not feasible and again, not safe for fish, because fish would be diving down and going through those different outlets. Let's see if I can make this work.
Down.
I knew I wouldn't make it work. The next one up is selective withdrawal structure alternatives. You'll see the first one there is the one that's moved forward. That's what everybody has seen over time, which is our selective withdrawal structure, our tower, our temperature control tower, we've sometimes referred it to. And the idea there is we'd have a fixed outlet at the bottom to get some cold water in, and we'd have a floating outlet to let some amount of warm water in. And that would meet our temperature and fish passage criteria if you put a fish collector out in front of it. Then we had variations of that. We have a sliding outlet, a single sliding outlet. In other words, that's trying to hit the right spot for the temperature. That's very difficult to do. And it's not good for fish. They could be diving down some amount. And then floating outlet with sliding outlet. And that's would have the floating outlet near the top with the sliding outlet that's very close to that, and you have competing interest. And then we have a short selective withdrawal structure. And the idea there was when you're above spillway crest, you could use the spillway. When you're below spillway crest, you have this tower, let's just say. that's only built to the bottom of the crest of the spillway, so that then you save some money by not having to build it as tall. But again, spillway is not safe route for fish passage, so that was ruled out. And then the next alternatives there, the last one, a floating surface outlet on a narrow tower. Kelly mentioned about the Navy test conduit, and that was put in when the dam was built, and it's another way to pass some amount of water. It's like a regulated outlet. So the idea there was, what if we built a small tower and we let some amount of water go through there to hit our right temperatures and pass fish through that also. But that was ruled out because while it looked like a low-cost alternative, because you wouldn't have this big tower, you couldn't build a tower that small, that tall. It would be unstable. So that's why you see that big triangle at the base. It very quickly got very big and cost as much as the one that does the full meal deal. So that got ruled out. So then the next alternatives are what we were calling out-of-the-box type of alternatives. And the first one there is to put pumps and aerators in the near field of the forebay. And the idea there is the temperatures stay warm at the top, they're colder at the bottom. So pump and agitate that water so that it mixes, so you don't have a stratification of warm water and cold water. You get that mix of that temperature, which is what we're trying to shoot for in effect downstream. But that would take a whole lot of energy trying to run pumps that are turning that reservoir over, because there's a mountain of water up there coming down that's just going to replace that water that we just stirred around. So that was determined not feasible. Next one up is heating and cooling system for the water. So pick the water out from wherever we're currently picking it out, but put the heating and cooling system on that. Again, that's a ton of energy. We'd be sending power up to Detroit to do that versus Detroit's generating power that gets sent out on the grid. So that got ruled out as not feasible. Pump water over the dam, that's again, sounds doable, but until you look at the details, and we're not talking about a small amount of water, we're talking about the whole entire North St. Anne flow, which could be 5,000 cubic feet per second, which is a ton of water we'd have to pump up over. And we're trying to hit a variable pool that hits the top of the pool reservoir, the reservoir pool elevation, which means you'd have to have a structure similar to what we're talking about in order to hit that top surface all the time. So that's very complicated and not doable. Next one up is a floating surface withdrawal structure. And that's this structure you see up here. It's a float that water would go into, and then some kind of a flexible pipe that would allow this to go up and down, and deemed impossible to be able to do, again, for the size we're talking about. And then the last one up there is a temperature control curtain. There's a temperature control curtain at Whiskey Town Lake down in the Shasta area. What that does is it blocks the reservoir so that the portion near the outlet works doesn't stratify. But it works at that reservoir because they're trying to get cold water out. They're trying to not have that warm water go down, and they're keeping the warm water upstream of that curtain and letting cold water come under the curtain. You see it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. Let the cold water go under the curtain and let that be the only water that goes out. We're trying to do something different in that we're trying to get rid of warm water so that we don't have it in the fall. And again, there's slides back there, poster boards that explain that more, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But we're trying to do the opposite. So when we figured out how a temperature curtain worked, we went, yeah, that doesn't serve our purpose. So another set of things we looked at, when we had our public scoping meetings, we heard some comments about if you brought in outside experts that are into building things in deep water and all that kind of thing. So we've done that now. And the very first one that they came up with was, what if you build a sloped SWS? So out there along the highway where the dam starts, where you can drive in, park your car, and walk across onto the dam, there's a canyon wall, it's rock. So their idea was, instead of building a vertical tower, build it leaning back on that rock face. And it sounds really cool because, in effect, you've got one wall of the structure built from the rock face. And the idea at one point was you could build that wall as you went down, and then as you worked at the bottom and then you filled back up, you could build the other three walls. But as we looked through this, and then you could have your fish collector hanging on that and going up and down the water. But as we looked at this, you have, instead of a vertical system that has debris that comes in and sinks down, you'd have an angled structure like this, and debris would come in and in effect lay on this structure. So we ruled that out as that's not an operationally sustainable system. So we moved away from that. And then the next one up is the locate the selective withdrawal structure on the other side of the reservoir, the other side of the dam, if you will, only the south side, not the downstream side. And you see the picture of it there. And the idea there was these outside experts said, there's already construction roads. You can see the road down there from when they built the dam versus the steep canyon hill that's on the highway side. But several problems with that. One is the fish tend to be near the powerhouse. We've done fish studies, we know that's where they go. So if we built this, would the fish actually go over to that spot instead of where they currently go? Maybe, but there's high risk and there's a lot of dollars at stake. But even worse is those conduits would have to go all the way back across to tie into the pin stock. And that's a mountain of work right there by itself, because they can't just be black lines that don't have any support holding them up. So that's ruled out for, that's really costly and has a high risk for fish. And then some alternatives we heard during the scoping were to have a temperature control tower on the downstream side of the dam. And that would be building it basically in the big cliff pool or on the ground downstream, but that does nothing to get the water out of the different outlets, different reservoir elevations inside the reservoir. So in order for that to work, we'd have to drill other holes through the dam, or it just flat out doesn't serve any purpose. So that was ruled out as it doesn't meet temperature and it doesn't do anything for fish passage. So that's not moving forward. And then one that's really, really cool, but we can't figure out any way to actually utilize it, is a comment came in about a research platform called FLIP. And what you see up here in the image that's long and horizontal is this boat that I think it's in the order of 300 feet long. And it can go out in its research vessel, and then they change the buoyancy, and the thing tilts up right, as you see on the far image. It's really slick, but that doesn't connect up to our dam to let all this volume of water through the pin stocks or the radiant outlets or anything. It's just a vessel that could flip upside down. So it's cool, but it doesn't really do much for us. And now I'm going to switch into downstream passage. And what we're looking at here initially were tributary alternatives. And that is where collect the juvenile fish in the tributaries, not at the dam, not in the reservoir, keep them out of the reservoir. So we looked at that. They're called header reservoir collection. But if you did that, you see two red dots there. In order to be successful, you have to have one of those at every tributary you want to put the fish in, as in the adult fish. They can go upstream at that point and spawn, and then you have juveniles coming down. Well, in order for a collector to work like that, you'd have to build a little miniature dam to make some impoundments so the fish don't just swim right out to the reservoir. And it only works for whichever tributaries you pick, instead of letting the adult fish swim up whichever tributary they choose. So that was ruled out for fish, and every time you build one, it's not just one, you're building multiples. So dollars, and we determined that's really not very feasible to move forward and build additional dams. And then we had some operational alternatives. An annual deep reservoir drawdown. In other words, draw the reservoir down and flush the fish out. And we decided that doesn't meet all of our missions, all of our authorized purposes. For instance, water supply, recreation, because if you're constantly flushing the water out, draining the reservoir down. And it doesn't guarantee that the fish will go out at the right time. They might be wanting to go, and they'll dive down and go out and die in the process of going downstream. So that was ruled out. And then prioritization of the radiant outlets in typical winter reservoir elevations. The idea there is when we draw down for the winter time, we're at 1450, and the radiant outlets are around 1340. I'm talking about feet in elevation. So they'd only have to dive down 90 feet instead of 200 feet or more. So would that do anything? Would that help fish? And we determined no, they're still diving down and then popping out the other side on the downstream side of the dam. And then the next up are structural alternatives for fish passage that are at the dam. And the first one there is floating surface collector, and that's that top image. They're basically a big V-screen, and you're running a bunch of pumps to draw water in, and then you dump that water back out in the forebay on the backside of the thing. And we ruled that out because that has a big long-term operations and maintenance tail, because you got to pay for the power to run those pumps, you got to maintain those pumps, and we have something in our favor, and that's a lot of gravity water flowing down through our system. So then the next one is utilize the temperature, the SWS, the selective withdrawal structure, as a fish passage structure. And we ruled that out because, again, the fish go into it because it's a surface flow, so they might go in, but then you have to dive down to the bottom and go out through the penstock or the regular outlet, so still doesn't serve any real purpose. So then we looked at what if we have a weir box attached to the selective withdrawal structure? And what that is that tiny little box you see there sticking out on that big tower. And the idea is the fish would swim into the selective withdrawal structure, they would get trapped in that wet well, and they couldn't swim back out. And now we've got them in what I always refer to as a small bathtub instead of the whole entire reservoir. So they would find that spot, but then we would have a small amount of flow out into this weir box and catch the fish there, because they would want to go there instead of dive down. All sounds really good on paper, but when we did more engineering on that and did some hydraulic calculations, the water goes in, and there's so much water going in to feed the two turbines that the water goes in, dives down, and the fish would never be able to find that weir box because it has too low a flow through that. So we ruled that out, which then leaves us with the one that you'll see there that says yes, and that is a floating screen structure attached to the SWS, or the temperature tower. And the idea there, you notice it has V-looking mechanisms, similar to the one on top, only what we're doing is all the water comes in from the surface, it feeds through the system and goes out through the penstocks, is gravity-fed water. We're not running pumps to do that. We're just drawing the water in, screening it so the fish can't get in the turbines, and capturing the fish at the back end of that device where the green color is on the float. Then one alternative we've got for downstream passage from the NEPA scoping process was to use a floating net capture device that attracts fish by pumping water out of the reservoir through a large hose or pipe through the dam spillway. And whenever the words net and capture are in the same sentence, the fish managers, our fish biologists, nobody likes that, because we're trying to let these fish volitionally go downstream as much as we can, not hook them up in some kind of a net and then somehow get them downstream. It's probably not safe for the fish. So we ruled that out as that doesn't meet NIPS criteria, and we're not going to move forward with that. And then we also are looking at, as Kelly said, downstream transportation alternatives. The first one up there is volitional passage. That's probably the Cadillac of everything. You let the fish come in. It's just like Kelly showed earlier, where you have the natural river like you see out here, and fish just naturally migrate downstream. So what that would be is you capture the fish in the fish collector through that V-screen, but back at that green box that I showed just a second ago, you have a pipe that then connects up, and at Detroit, we have that test conduit. So you have a pipe that somehow goes from the back of that fish collector down through that hole. Now, there are a ton of challenges there, because you've got this reservoir that's changing 120 feet, and you got this pipe that has to go through a fixed point. So we haven't figured that all out, but we're working that, and that's another team that I've got working that one. Then the other one is what most other facility like this has done, and that is trap and haul, where you capture the fish in that green box that you saw at the back of the collector, and then there's pods or hoppers that have the juvenile fish in it with water. You pick those up and put them on a truck, you drive them downstream somewhere, and you let them go loose downstream, and they go out to the ocean. One alternative that came out of the public scoping was some kind of a fish ladder or bypass channel. And Detroit Dam is 450 feet tall with a varying reservoir elevation of 120 feet. And we'd already looked at that and dismissed it way early on. But we looked at it again, and it's just not feasible to make that happen. It's not the Columbia dams where we have fish ladders and things that there the pool changes 5 feet. Here, we're talking 120 feet. So not feasible to move forward. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly.
So after looking at all those alternatives, we came up with the one that really is only feasible and meets our purpose and need and meets all the screening criteria so far is a selective withdrawal structure with a floating screen structure and potentially trap and haul or volitional passage. So how do we construct that? And these are the alternatives that you saw at scoping probably. The first alternative was the favorite of the construction engineers, obviously, is do a deep drawdown and build in the dry, because it's easy to build a tower or any large structure when you're not under hundreds of feet of water. And do that for 2 years. The next alternative was to do a deep drawdown for a single year, build as much as you can in the dry, do all the blasting and the foundation, which is some of the hardest work, build as much as you can, and then build the rest in the wet. So both of those are feasible, so they're going to be in the EIS as a potential alternative, and we're going to look at all the impacts associated with that. And we understand that those are very concerning for everyone because they have major impacts on recreation, on water supply, on environmental flows for fish downstream, on water quality. Then we also looked at what we called a variable low drawdown with a cofferdam. So basically you would draw it down, build a temporary dam around your construction area, and then let the lake fill up and you'd have a dry area behind that. Unfortunately, that's not feasible and it's incredibly costly because you're basically building a 100-foot temporary dam within a dam. So we screened that out pretty early on. The next one we looked at after scoping was, or I think actually this was shown at scoping as still feasible, was doing what we called a 1-year variable drawdown, where we would draw down, build a foundation, and then raise the elevation of the water to wherever we finished and continue building in the dry as we move up. So it would be all during construction, but we would move the lake around to meet us. We screened that out because it doesn't really do anything additionally for us as far as helping us, or it helps us a little bit because we're building in the dry, but it still has the same effects as the 1-year drawdown building in the dry. So it really it didn't pan out as like a feasible option that would be worth looking at further. So we screened that out. At the time of scoping, I think we were still considering it. But that actually transformed in what we're calling the build in the wet 1-year variable drawdown. And this is an idea of reducing the level of the lake so that we will have less deep water to build in. So the water will be shallower, it will still be fairly deep, but we'll build in the wet. But we still will be able to meet a lot of the water supply needs downstream. So this was a direct result of public scoping. We said, how do we meet this water supply concern? Because obviously, 190,000 people living in Salem, as well as at Gates and Staten and Lyons, they all depend on this flow in the summer. How do we maintain enough flow to supply that throughout the summer years? So we, through some modeling, found 1,400, I think 1,450, 1,400. And that would be able to meet the water supply demand, but also reduce the risk of deep water diving. So that one we're still looking at. And then the final one was just do deep water diving and don't change reservoir operations at all and build the entire thing in the wet without changing the reservoir levels. So the 4 that we're moving forward with are the 2 build in the dry and the 2 build in the wet with slightly different impacts to the reservoir levels. Some construction alternatives we got from scoping. One really interesting one was what we're calling dams within a dam. So in order to meet the concern for water supply, could we build a bunch of temporary dams to hold back water, but still have a dry area to build down near the dam? So we looked at that, and a temporary dam is typically a blow-up dam. They're max about 20 feet tall, maybe 100 feet long. When we did our analysis, in order to hold back enough water to meet water supply demands throughout the summer, we would need to build, I think, 5 of those temporary dams. They would all need to be about 100 feet tall because that canyon is super, super steep. So in order to get any water behind them, any amount of water that would be useful, they'd have to be very tall. They'd also have to be thousands of feet long. So basically we were building up 5 very large dams. And we'd spend a whole season or 2 or 3 just building temporary dams. So it doesn't solve any of our problems. So good idea, didn't pan out. Another one was to build what's called a pneumatic caisson, which is basically build a temporary structure that creates a pressurized area within it. And then you can work in the dry. Workers get pressurized before they go down there, like they're divers, but they're working in the dry. And then you can use the reservoir as much as you want. Those work really well in shallower construction areas that have muddy bottoms because you can just sink the structure into the ground. We're on bedrock here, so it would be very difficult to actually make that connection and make the vacuum required. It also would be we have to do blasting, and doing blasting in a pressurized environment is dangerous. There were some other safety concerns, so we screened that out as not feasible. Oh, I missed the middle one. Oh yes, sorry. One thing we got over and over actually was, why don't you just build this in the winter when you're not going to be impacting anyone? Because the reservoir is already drawn down a lot in the winter. So we did a lot of modeling, hydraulic modeling, to determine if that was feasible. You know, maybe it'll take us 10 years rather than 5 years or 20 years, but at least we won't be impacting folks. So we did look at that very closely, and based on the entire record of hydrology, this dam fills up very quickly with each storm event. It can go up 80 feet in like a day. A couple days, it could go up 80 feet throughout the winter. So when we looked at it, it was about, we would have maybe 34 days in the dry in the winter throughout that 3-month period that we do winter reservoir operations. And those aren't consecutive. So we would basically have a month, but like here and there days to actually work, and it takes days or weeks to move equipment in and out. So we basically found that it just wasn't feasible. We would never get any work done. So that was screened out. Good idea, but unfortunately it didn't work. All right, staging. So staging basically is where you put your equipment, where you put your materials. We have to look at the impact of that because it often, you know, we're taking up space that would otherwise be used, or there's big equipment moving in and out. We might have to cut down some trees, so this is also an important part of construction. We looked at several areas for both just staging equipment and then also areas for staging stuff and building pieces of the project that can then be floated into place. So for the temperature control tower, you can build pieces of it, float it into place, and put them together like Legos. Also, for the floating screen structure, you basically build the whole thing at a staging location and then float the whole thing into place because it's basically a large barge. So of all the staging only places, they're all moving forward. They're all located, you know, downstream of the dam or right at the dam, and they're all like areas that we own. They are pretty much out of the way except for that parking lot right at the dam, but there's going to be a big construction project, so that's going to be impacted no matter what. Of the staging and construction areas, we looked at Emily Creek, which is just to the south of the dam, upstream. It's this little tributary. It's a really steep canyon, so it would require a lot of leveling. And so just the cost of creating access roads and leveling that area and keeping it dry just didn't seem feasible. So we screened that out. The next one was Moncold State Park, which you saw scoping. This seemed like a great place. It's flat, has a giant parking lot, really easy access in, safe access. But what we heard over and over is, you know, that's one of our most visited sites. If you're going to impact that for 10 years, because it's not only the temperature control tower, it's also the floating screen structure, that'll be impacting the community in a tremendous way for a really long period of time. So we heard that loud and clear, and at the time we had no other really ideal places, flat places that we could float the things into place. So we went to our friends at Forest Service and the state parks and said, hey, you guys know this lake really well. When the water's down, do you know of any accessible flat areas that we could use as staging? And they said, actually, we have some great spots for you. We have the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department maintenance yard, which is right upstream of Mongold. It's not accessible by the public, so we wouldn't have safety concerns there. It's got a pretty easy exit off the highway, so that would be safe. And we could share the area with the maintenance yard folks. And it's actually a flatter surface than at Mongold, so it would be easier to construct there. So we were really excited to find that place. And then right upstream of that is the Detroit campground. It also is flatter. It has okay access. We would have to deconstruct half of the campground, which is about 50 years old, so it's a kind of an important place, just in terms of being a place that's been in the community for a long time. And it's a really nice campground. We'd also have the issues with public safety because there would be folks using the area right next to a big construction. So we are looking at that. It's feasible, but it's less attractive than the maintenance yard. And then finally, we also looked at Dutch Flat upstream, but it's too shallow up there to be actually able to float things into place. So we screened that out as not feasible. All right, so here we are at the end finally. Thank you all for sitting through that very detailed presentation. So of course, under NEPA, we always have to look at the no action. That means if we did nothing, what would be the impact of the project? It is also a way of comparing the impacts of the project to existing conditions. So we are still looking at no action. And then for temperature control fish collection, there really is only the one feasible option at Detroit, which is the selective withdrawal structure paired with a floating screen structure. And then for fish transport, we're still looking at volitional passage as well as the trap and haul. Volitional passage, like he said, has its own team working on whether or not it's feasible. And then for construction, we have the 2-year load drawdown, 1-year load drawdown, that variable build in the wet that helps us meet flow needs downstream, but reduces some of our risk, and then the build in the wet normal operations. So a lot of folks tell me, the construction engineers are going to win. We're going to pick the easiest, most cost-effective for the Corps, and that's really not the case. For example, we added a whole new alternative based on concerns, so we're taking it very seriously and we're looking at these very clearly. And the impacts will be fully looked at for each of these alternatives. The costs will be looked at. This isn't just a cost decision, it's a impacts and cost prioritization decision. And then finally, our staging areas. So that's the array of alternatives you will see in the draft EIS that comes out in April, May, hopefully. And so to stay informed, this whole presentation is a summary of a report that details every alternative and how it was screened. That report is available at this website. So if you have more questions that don't get answered by our folks today, you can download that report and read all about it. We also have the scoping report, which summarizes the comments that we heard during the scoping period. And then, like I said, the draft EIS will be coming out hopefully in the spring of 2019. We have a distribution list. If you're not already on it, make sure that you signed in the front with your email address. And I manage that list. I'll make sure that you're on it and that you'll get updates not only of upcoming meetings or reports that come out in the interim, but also when that draft EIS is available and how you can get your hands on it and how you can comment. The comment period is required 45 days, but we'll likely do a longer 60-day comment period just to give people enough time. And we will have public meetings to basically summarize the outcomes of that EIS so that when you get it, you'll have kind of a primer. And then finally, if for some reason you want to really make sure you're on that list, you can just email subscribe to this email address and I will add you. Do you want to add anything else?
So, as Kelly said, when we started this process, we didn't have all those alternatives for the drawdown or no drawdown. We had a narrower list. And, another thing is, over time, whenever I was out, because as Kelly said, I've been on this since day one, back in 2009, in one capacity or another. And when we started this back in 2009, we had a structure, what I called then, bolted onto the upstream face of the dam that wasn't a freestanding tower. So as we're going through this, we're seeing all the concerns with the drawdown and what those impacts are. And, Kelly mentioned the city, all the different cities that draw water out of there, but there's also a whole bunch of farmers that draw that water out. And we're understanding that it's not just a one-year impact, but it could kill their fruit tree or their nut tree or whatever it is that they're growing and have an extended impact. So we're realizing the impacts are not small, and our decision to go to an EIS was the right one. But what we're also doing is we're looking, I've got multiple teams that are looking at how do we build this in the wet for those two different alternatives. You saw there, one drawing down to somewhere around 1,400 and one drawing in with normal roll curve. And what we end up at the end may not look like what you've seen so far as in this freestanding tower with all that mechanism. Serve the same purpose, but are there ways to make this easier for in the wet? And I think that summarizes what our presentation was. And I'll turn it over to Dustin to facilitate our questions.
So my purpose is to facilitate Q&A. Want to make sure that I'm going to use people around the room, some folks that we brought down that are subject matter experts in these fields, and also make sure that we break with enough time so if you want to talk one-on-one with these folks, you can. So, Jeff, does everybody get what they need to off this slide? I'm thinking in terms of Q&A that you go to the second to last slide. Opportunity for folks to see, where some things have narrowed, and I think there's been some confusion over, have you decided on an alternative yet? Some of these alternatives have narrowed, some of them have expanded as part of this process. But I guess that's probably a good place to start. Questions on what you've heard so far? Yes, sir.
Is there, I know some kind of, I don't have the technical details, but there were projects done at Cuba and also at Lake Ocean. Is there any demonstration that this sulfur water withdrawal actually does what it's intended to do?
Yes.
So at Cougar, we built a temperature control tower there that already had a tower that was the device that regulated water that went out to the regulated outlets or to the pin stock. Prior to building that temperature control structure at Cougar, when let me rephrase that and start that over a little bit. Let's go back in time. When Cougar was built, there was an adult fish trap built downstream of the dam to collect adult fish as they swam up. No fish ever came up to there. That was back years and years ago. And as scientists and biologists started to understand what's going on here, they realized it's because the temperatures weren't right. The fish would get partway up there and then would go, oh, that's not the right time of year, something's not right. And they never went up there. We built that temperature control tower, and before we built our adult fish facility, there were adult fish hanging around in the downstream right at the outlet of the powerhouse, wanting to go further upstream. Now with that adult collection facility there, we're collecting 300 to 500 adult fish every year. So we went from 0 to 300 to 500 fish just with changing the temperature downstream.
I heard informally, I guess, from a couple of guys, and a woman that actually is, I guess, a pretty accomplished fish biologist, that the results at Pelton Dam were really pretty unsatisfactory.
It's a different question. John, do you want to talk about, just briefly, in what we've looked at in other facilities around the region and how we're using that information?
Well, at Pelton Dam, so there's two components. There's the temperature control component and then there's the fish collection component. And it's a much different facility than we have. And they have been doing temperature control operations, and I think they've been able to mix flow and provide that temperature control downstream. And then they've been collecting fish as well. And so the way they operate, there's a lot of power peaking that occurs, and so they do collect fish. The way that they're oriented in the forebay is a little bit different than what we're doing. They are kind of sticking out in an area that's not around structure. What we're trying to do is learn from the other collectors around the region and what makes them successful at catching fish and what is problematic. And one of the things we've identified with our structure being close to the dam and the data that we've collected is that the fish, as they migrate through the reservoir, they exhibit a lot of directional persistence. And so they do end up at the dam, and when they're at the dam, they exhibit milling behavior. And when we have a surface route that's available, such as the spillway, a lot of our data shows that they do in fact utilize the spillway, and they do provide a hydraulic, or they do prefer a hydraulic drop. And we try to replicate that and use those features in our design to achieve effective fish passage.
So, well, one specific complaint that I heard from the 3 people was a lot of algae buildup all the way down into the Deschutes River.
And it may be just a different, kind of a different situation than we have here, but water quality is something maybe we can talk more about with some folks one-on-one. I think going back to your original question, temperature, we know from what we've built before that we can successfully manipulate temperatures downstream and get them to where we want them to be. And we are looking at other facilities in the region, trying to take advantage of what they've learned through their construction and operation to optimize what we're doing here, and we're trying to apply. It's just
We found when the lake inadvertently was drawn down to quite a low level recently, that there was ancillary damage, environmental impact to outlying areas that actually don't have a direct impact with the river. For example, just across the mountain here is the Little North Fork. The Little North Fork area was damaged so extensively that the county and the state and the federal government have had to make terrific allowances by hiring more police, more fire crews, etc. And what I'm concerned about, because I didn't hear anything about this one so far, and maybe you've already considered it. What have you done to, if you decide a summertime deep drawdown, what have you done to consider the mitigation of environmental damage in the surrounding areas that are not immediately adjacent to the river itself?
I'm trying to understand the example you gave, because I'm not familiar with it. But as far as like the deep drawdown alternatives, that analysis is still ongoing.
Yeah.
So I don't have an answer for how we're going to mitigate, because we have to look at what the impacts, we have to fully characterize what the impacts are before we can decide what mitigation will be. But yes, we are looking at the greater, it's not just at the project, we're looking at the larger
So
watershed area.
Maybe as an example of that, because I think I understand what you're getting at. If there is a drawdown, or in a drawdown, we have to look at impacts to cultural resources as an example. So, if we're going to be down and it's going to impact access to cultural resource sites, part of what we would have to figure out how to mitigate is the potential risk and damage to those sites. So those things may be immediately within the lake bed, they may be in the upper reaches of the lake, but we certainly would be looking at the comprehensive impacts. I know that there's been an awful lot more focus on water supply and recreation impacts, but those things do have to be part of the consideration.
Well, and I think that's a fair thing, that you're worried about the water supply for the farms and the people. However, the impact of removing the recreational use of the lake causes people to go to other areas that aren't able to withstand the damage that's happening. If there was a lot of damage, there were fires that were caused by, well, 2 weeks ago, there were 1,800 vehicles counted by the state going up into the North Fork Canyon. And a lot of that happened because the lake was drawn down and inadvertently people found out that this was a really nice area, et cetera. But there will be, and I understand that it hasn't been chosen, I understand that you're still considering that. But it is something, how might I be able to, at this time, to give you some input along with the county, because they're very concerned about the same situation, about the impact of environmental damage by overuse of areas that can no longer go to Detroit Lake.
How many years is it that this was going to happen? I live on the North Fork too. So is it just one summer that this is going to happen, or is this going to go over several summers? Because if we have the impact over several summers, I mean, I've noticed the fish in our river, last year, I only had 2 fish. I sat in the river and I had 2 fish come to me after a couple hours. This year, we have a few more little tiny fish, but the fish from when I first moved up here 15 years ago, on the North Fork, there's a lot less fish coming up our way. And we come off the Santiam River too. So if you're working on the impact here, you have to really look at us too, because we are also a supplier of your fish downstream. So it's important for you to include us when you're making your environmental studies.
Sure. Yeah, and to your question of how many years, those alternatives are the ones we're looking at. So 2 years drawdown, 1 year drawdown, or 1 year variable drawdown, or no drawdown. So those are, we will make it so the contractor cannot build for whatever the preferred alternative is. If it's a 1 year variable drawdown, they will only get that 1 year of that level of water, and then afterwards they have to construct in normal operations. So we hear a lot like, oh, this is gonna, you're gonna take the 2 year drawdown, and then it's gonna end up being 3 years because it's the federal government. I mean, that's definitely not what we're proposing. That's not how it works. Like, we have requirements and when we contract things out, so, and you can talk a little bit more about that too.
You're absolutely right, though, about that dispersed use. I know it's a discussion that's come up with Lynn County. I know the State Marine Board is also looking at that and trying to figure out ways to plan for that use and enhance facilities. That's right there. So it is a discussion that's going on in behind these alternatives, and as we get down to that alternative, figuring out how to mitigate those impacts is part of that.
Well, I really want you to take a point just in looking at our forest up there on the North Fork and the forest here, with the droughts that we've had, those trees are really fragile up there. And the more impacted, the more people we have in that little winding canyon, the greater it is for all of us to die. I mean,
Gentleman in the back.
Which of you is the engineer? I'm curious. So if Detroit Dam isn't built, you want to build a dam, you want to put one in on the North Santiam River for, now we have what? We have flood risk, we have, let's see what it says. It says on here the primary purpose is flood management or flood mitigation. Then here it says that the other authorized primary purposes, hydropower, water quality improvement, which obviously hard to have with blue green algae and the dam. Irrigation, fish and wildlife habitat. And the reason the 2008 decision was based on the protection, the primary purpose of the fish and wildlife habitat, right? That's the 2008 decision, which prompted you folks to go ahead and try to figure out a way to put in this tower. I guess that's the decision now to put in the tower. But if you could go back, there's no dam there. You need a dam on the North Santiam for these reasons, or what would you do? How would you put a dam? You certainly would put a dam like that in now, would you?
So
because you got to protect the fish. 2008, you have to protect the fish. So what would you do?
That's a very hypothetical question.
It is.
Seems how Detroit Dam's already there.
Well, I know. Well,
But it would be an enlightening mind experiment to do.
So,
It would be like
so anyway,
let's finish this question.
What would you do?
So in order to meet flood control or flood risk reduction, you need to have a dam somewhere to hold back water. There's images of Corvallis and Salem and Eugene and Portland all being underwater every year because that was before the dams were here. Now there's a lot of people that live within the floodplain in those cities. So I think this valley needs to have dams here for that flood.
Okay.
And whether it would look like this or look like something else, the only thing I could say for sure is, I don't know if it'd be there, but they picked that spot because it's the narrowest spot in the canyon. The two, we would now be following the buyout requirements to make those dams fish friendly, like we're trying to do now.
Right.
With a dam that's already there.
So what kind of a dam would you put in?
So,
You
but
know,
yes, and again, hypothetical discussion, probably a good one to have on the side, but you would have a dam with the features that we're describing here as part of the original construction. Remember that when the dams were built, there was thought given to how do we get fish over the dam. We know that there are going to be impacts, but the science at the time, what was tried, was not successful. So I guess the hypothetical answer to your hypothetical question would be, you would see a dam that looks very much like it does now for flood risk management, because we know it functions very well for that purpose, and for hydropower and other benefits, with these additional features that allow us to manage temperature control and fish passage based on all the science that we have today.
But you don't know how the fish are gonna make it back through there. That's a problem. Once you, if you get them out there,
That
you
is
don't know how
design.
you're gonna make it through. So wouldn't you figure out a way to have a dam, because the 2008 priority is for the fish?
So-
Wouldn't you figure out a way to put in a dam that could resolve that
So
issue?
we've already built into an adult fish collection facility, which is downstream of Big Cliff.
Oh.
That was already an adult facility that was put in there way back when Detroit was built. We rebuilt that per the 2008 bylaw. So we collect adult fish there, we truck them up above, and whenever we have these pieces in to get the juvenile fish safely back downstream, those fish that are wild fish will be released above Detroit so they can swim up those different tributaries that are.
And where has that worked?
That's working all over the place.
It's working, that those fish are making it downward all over the place?
So the fish are making
So
it back, the adult fish are making it back, and what we're trying to do is solve the downstream.
Where is that making
Then
it?
how come they're not going up Norfolk Road? I mean, up the.
No, where is it making, what, you said all over the place.
So
Where is
I
it
want
making
to,
it
before
better?
we just get tied into a conversation, I want to give other people an opportunity to ask questions. And if you want to
Yeah.
continue this on the side, we've got John, who's a fish biologist. We can talk more in detail about that. This gentleman's got his hand up, and I'll come to you, sir.
I'm just a simple sailor, so I don't really understand. Please, if you're gonna put this tower in Detroit, gonna control temperature of water going out of Detroit, which will then go into Big Cliff. It'll be further diluted in Big Cliff. And when I was here before, I was told that you're gonna be able to control the temperature all the way to the Willamette River. I just can't see how that's gonna happen, because you've got other tributaries coming in. It's gonna, you know, to me, once you put that temperature controlled water into Big Cliff, you've lost control of it.
So one of the things we know since 2007, we've been doing interim temperature operations, which is spilling water over the top and using penstock water. It goes into Big Cliff, and we're successful at managing temperature downstream to get fish back in that tributary, to get fish back and to protect fish that are spawning in those reaches. So we know it works. And Big Cliff, we learned a little bit more this year as we started to look not only at temperature, but also the algae issue. It moves through Big Cliff fairly quickly. And so we know that we can be successful. Big Cliff does not have a negative impact on temperature. It allows us to be successful in this interim operation we have now. So I don't really think Big Cliff is an issue. And for the purposes that we're trying to impact, we've been successful at that through that narrow band of the year. We're trying to extend that to make sure we can do that over the full region.
And right now, sorry, to add a little bit more. So right now, this operations we have, we spill when we're not generating power. And then other times of the day, we're not spilling, we're generating power. And Big Cliff acts like a mixing pool. We hit the right temperature going downstream of Big Cliff. With this new system, we're going to be able to skid water off of both at the same time and have that temperature going into Big Cliff, which makes it even better.
And produce power.
And produce power out of that water.
So what you're saying is it works, to what you're doing now works?
I'm going to let this gentleman ask questions, and then I'll come back. Yes, sir.
It's on track, and you're going to do a full environmental impact statement on these alternatives. And under that top category, you're only going to look at one alternative. And then a lot of the talk was sort of explaining all these different alternatives that would kind of go in that category there. And I'm just I don't understand why you wouldn't throw a couple of those alternatives into your EIS analysis, because it looks like that analysis all sort of got done internally and put in this report. It seemed like a couple of those alternatives would still meet flood control objectives, and there'd be some different pros and cons and so forth, but it's just seems sort of odd to me that there's a full EIS on these alternatives, but not on those alternatives in the first category that have been excluded.
Yeah. So, yes, there's only one alternative for those, because the other alternatives either didn't they violated our constraints, they didn't meet the purpose and need, they didn't meet our criteria, or they just weren't feasible. So there's no real reason to do continued analysis on things that just aren't going to meet those three things that it has to meet. So that's why we got to one alternative, and we have all the backup analysis to support that decision. There really is, I mean, we looked at 21 alternatives for temperature control. There really is only one that works at Detroit based on the configuration of how Detroit works and what the authorized purposes are.
Okay.
And keep in mind what Kelly said is, you're trying to move on. But what Kelly said to start with was we were doing an environmental assessment back in those days when we were scratching those off, until we realized the impacts were bigger than that. But if we would have followed the EA through, if we would have went out for public comment, we'd have had, hey, these don't move forward. And all we did was go right to an EIS, to public scoping.
Yeah. But doing EIS with just that one alternative.
Right.
Yeah,
That's true.
my point, yeah.
It's the only reasonable alternative other than no action.
Two quick
Mr. O'Brien,
questions.
yes, sir.
Two quick questions. On the deep drawdown one, it looks like you're going to have flow issues at the middle traffic facility in terms of minimum flow of trap fish. Is that part of the consideration of the EIS? Because if you look at the bottom, you might not have enough water to trap fish to bring them in. That was one question. And the second one, since you've been doing this temperature control over the last several years, we're seeing a change in the algal populations, and particularly the toxic algae. Is there any part of the EIS that's going to look at the change in Big Cliff and in terms of the thermocline nutrient cycle and thermoclines and all of that change because you're going to do temperature in terms of the overall ecology, not just full temperature issue because you have dissolved gas, but there's nothing in there to deal with nitrogen, phosphorus, and in some cases when you change that cold water at turnover, you bring up a lot of metals that are trapped in the sediments, and so that will affect the whole region. So is that part of the EIS?
Yeah, so to your first question, Minto, you're absolutely correct. At certain, they have to have, I think, 900 CFS in the river to function for their pumps to work. So there will be impacts to the operation of Minto. They won't be able to function for certain periods of time. That'll be analyzed in the EIS, and that might be some impact that we just have to live with,
In terms of fish harvest?
Yeah, correct. So there are other mitigations we're considering, like potentially putting a temporary trap further downstream of Bennett.
There already is one down there from when Minto was.
Yeah, there's one.
Yeah.
So that could be reutilized.
Yeah, so that's one potential mitigation. To your second question, yes, we're doing a full, unfortunately, our water quality person wasn't able to make it tonight. He should be there tomorrow at the SALA meeting. But yes, he is looking at all the water quality constituents, you know, all the different concerns like blue-green algae and nutrients and things like that. Unfortunately, with blue-green algae, we have limited data sets, but he's working on ways that we can use that data to try to make some predictions about what these different alternatives will mean for construction and for operations. Like you said, will mixing the water cause issues with water quality in terms of blue-green algae?
Will that model include a change in the turnover rates in the lake?
I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. Hopefully he does, but yeah, he's working on how to make that work with the data that we have. And then as far as the constituents, we did do sediment testing throughout the lake to get a better idea of what contaminants are there. Preliminarily, I think we got some results back that it's very low levels, so that's great to hear. But I think he will be doing some analysis on what constituents we will be downstream and what it means for operations.
Gentlemen.
So what has kicked off the whole purpose of this project for the work control?
What's driving it?
Yeah.
So we have federally listed fish species, so fish were listed as endangered. What was referred to, and somebody said earlier, the 2008 decision was, it's the biological opinion for the continued operation of the Willamette Valley project, so all 13 dams. And so what we're looking at is how to address the issues impacting those listed fish species in this basin and continue to maximize those other benefits, flood risk management, hydropower, recreation, into the future. So a statement was made earlier that fish was the only driver in this, and really fish was, the listing of those fish species was that starting point. But the biological opinion is really about sustaining those benefits, all of those benefits, figuring out how to balance those things over the continued operation of the project.
But the study then is that the return of salmon and steelhead up in North Fork has declined tremendously. Has it declined in the South San Diego as well, and a little North Fork as well?
Yeah, we're seeing impacts everywhere.
Are there any projects for those?
And there are. We've got very similar things going on. We have different applications, but in the South San Diego, on Fall Creek, we're looking at issues in the Middle Fork, up to McKenzie and Cougar. So similar responsibilities on our part, figure out how to address temperature, figure out how to address adult fish collection and passage upstream, juveniles downstream, looking at habitat and how to maximize that, all things that were under that RPA. But yes, it is going on throughout the basin, and we've completed a number of those projects as well.
Well, then if it's continued throughout the basin, I would like you to clean the fish ladder at Salmon Falls, because that's part of the problem with the fish getting up above Salmon Falls. No one has gotten all the debris out of that fish ladder.
If I understand the captain correctly, you're not taking into consideration anything about the seals and sea lions and getting all the salmon and steelheads and the salmon and Willamette.
Not as part of this project, but that is something that is being looked at outside of the scope of
I
this.
keep hearing there's tons of seals and sea lions, and we're taking tons of salmon and steelhead. Why isn't that done?
Because our action here is to figure out temperature and fish passage at the trough. The issues downstream are being looked at by other folks, and we have people in our agency that are part of that discussion. It's just not in the scope of this project. It is relevant to fish recovery in the basin, no disagreement there. But it is just not part of what Jeff's charged to
It
do.
seems like that should be the first thing to handle.
Did you want to say something? Oh, yes. Of course. Dave?
Justin, I guess the fish people aren't here. The dam has been built, 60-some years in operation. I keep wondering how we have wild fish. If the dam has been there and locked them, we've been running the system up to the Hack Creek back, we've raised it and released. How did we come to protect a fish that hasn't gone through the dam as a free fish, as a wild fish? And yet, we raise them in Hack Creek and release them, but they're not good enough because they get
I
there.
see somebody itching to answer that question, maybe behind.
No, I'm sure I wanted to hear the question, so I'm going to do that way. I'm with No Fisheries, so. And Odie, if you could make it here tonight, we'll be working closely with that and these guys here. Just to specify, North Team is a little bit special because we have this area between Minto and Big Cliff, and so we manage these fish in a way where we can try to protect the wild fish that we do still have. So when fish come back to the trap, we put the wild spawning naturally producing fish between Minto and Big Cliff and allow them to have kind of their own access to that area. And we don't put the hatchery origin fish there. We currently put the hatchery origin fish above Detroit. So those two populations, anytime once they come back to Minto, they're not spawning together. So what we're trying to do is preserve the genetic diversity and the life history diversity that's associated with the wild population, because we believe that makes them less likely to go extinct. So over time, we believe that makes them more resilient. Once we have this circuit in place where we can actually get the offspring of the fish that we outplanted above Detroit Dam down safely, then we would manage this in a split basin approach, the way we do at Foster, which is move only wild fish above once we have a sustaining population there, and then all of that above dam habitat would be for the wild fish recovery, and any necessary hatchery mitigation or supplementation, those fish would be below the dams where they are now. So that's, the idea is to allow eventually wild fish to be using that. And again, the idea is, so this, we've used the word, well, we were talking about the buyout, and Kelly Ray briefly mentioned these viable sustainable populations. It's numbers of fish, but we also consider their spatial structure and their diversity, both like their genetic diversity and their life history diversity. And all of those things have to be healthy for us to look at the probability of extinction over the next 100 years and decide that they are unlikely or very unlikely to go extinct. So that's what we're going for, is getting those populations resilient.
But you've done this project recently, like in Burlington. What happened before that, 50 years before, when maybe that was not done? I have a cattle herd, I raise cattle. If I wanted to increase I want to make my herd better. I don't go out and buy 15 new cows and make it better. I get one bull to make my herd, and I keep changing bulls and get my genetic from there. Why not take the male salmon or steelhead and go to the hatchery, use that semen to raise and keep each generation moving back to as close as you're going to get the one, because I can't believe that for wild animals, 50 or 60 years, you're getting close to them. But if they didn't put those things, I don't know.
Right,
The
right.
swine isn't going to care whether they're put things.
That's very true. So I will say, Brad, that OEW are the experts on this, they're the people that manage that hatchery. No, Johnson Controller. You couldn't be here tonight, they are happy to take your questions. But also we have our hatchery division, and they are concerned really with this later. They just released a document that is about how do we take a select few wild fish and incorporate them into our brood stock, and that's actually under review for a similar NEPA process right now. There's some comments on that. But we're very lucky in the Willamette in that we have hatchery stocks that are closely related to our wild fish. So we can try to use them to supplement or keep our wild fish populations afloat until we have strong passage and have been realizing that. So these hatchery genetic management plans are our attempts to preserve as much of that wild diversity using the hatchery fish, either keeping them separated or using them in very specific ways to help support that. So if you want more information, we can follow up.
Yeah, you know what, and I'm just reading faces in the room. We will stay here, these folks will stay here as long as you want to ask really specific detailed questions. What I'd suggest is, let's break the Q&A session now. We have folks that will be here to talk about NEPA, about construction, about O&M, that's Tim and myself, fish biology. We'll stay here as long as you want to answer those questions. Thank you for your attention. There's a lot of information tonight. This information, again, we have a website up there that you can stay connected to it, know when the next round of information is coming out. Our commitment is to keep telling you what's going on, and we will continue to tell you where we are in the process, how your input has shaped it, and we'll continue to work to do that better each time. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.